Now we discuss the ever elusive call to action. This is something that most podcasters don't start with, and they beat themselves up a couple of years in because they wish they'd started this with their very first episode. Mostly people don't start with their call to action because they either don't know to, or more often than not, they find it very awkward to ask somebody for something. So essentially, your call to action is asking your listener to do something for you. And it feels really, it feels very embarrassing at the start of a podcast when you're just getting your sort of feet wet to already start making demands from people, which is why a lot of people avoid this. Essentially, your call to action is asking your listener to do something for you. And it feels really, it feels very embarrassing at the start of a podcast when you're just getting your sort of feet wet to already start making demands from people, which is why a lot of people avoid this at the very beginning of your show, because if you start to do it somewhere after 30-40 episodes, then it comes out of left field and your listeners start to be more disgruntled at that point than when it actually is a part of your show from the very beginning. So now when it comes to your call to action itself, there are a few considerations that you need to keep in mind. Your first consideration is at the very beginning of this course, we discussed why somebody starts their podcast, or what are the goals that somebody has when they start their podcast. Your goals may be one out of three, as we discussed. One is that you want to build a network and you want to build social credibility. The second one is that you want to sell something that is not related to your podcast. You want to sell something outside of your podcast, whether this is a service that you're offering or whether this is a particular product. If you're a D2C brand that you're selling to some. The final one is that you want to make the podcast itself into an asset that you actually monetize from. So these are essentially your goals. Now your call to actions are essentially creating a series of steps that make these goals possible. And if you don't put them in now, then it becomes very difficult to integrate them later. So essentially, this is one of the reasons why it is so important to think about this at this point in time. Now, where should you put your calls to action? So you have three main places to put your calls to action. You have the start of your podcast, or what the industry calls the pre-roll. You have somewhere in the middle of your podcast that makes intuitive sense, which is your mid-roll. And then you have the end of your podcast, which is your post-roll. So regardless of what your goal is, so we have spoken about three goals right now. At the very beginning of your show, you don't want to ask your listeners for too much because it feels like an unfair transaction at that point in time. So at this stage, you just want to ask for very soft calls to action that don't take too much effort from somebody, and then over time we can begin to ramp this up, whether it's monetization or social credibility. So at the very beginning of your podcast, you want to focus on three things. You want to focus on making sure that you are getting their email IDs, and the predominant reason for doing this is so that you can notify them when you're launching the new episode, or when there are certain changes that are going to be coming to your podcast. If you going forward want to even log certain episodes and monetize from your podcast. So the second call to action that you need is that you want people to be able to build your credibility, especially for your show. So you want them to leave a review for your show either on Spotify, on Apple, or in the best case scenario on Podchaser. So essentially, this is something that's fairly low touch for listeners, and if you can get them to do this as a secondary call to action, that's an ideal situation. And then your tertiary call to action should be for as a request to ask your listeners to follow you on your social media channel of choice. So don't try to get them to follow you across all channels. The one that you're most active on and the one that you're most comfortable with, that is your tertiary call to action. right? So now you need to figure out where to put these calls to action. So your first call to action, which is your primary call to action, you're focused on getting the email ID, which is the most valuable thing you can get currently from your listener, should be in the pre-roll aspect of your podcast episode. So this doesn't mean that it's you need to ask for it before the episode begins. But essentially, after you create your intro, you can essentially ask people for their email address, either by giving them access to some sort of lead magnet. Let's say if you're creating a show about business hacks, you can say, come to my website and sign up to get access to the 20 best tips on how to go from 0 to 1 as a SaaS startup. Or if you're creating something that's more pop culture oriented, and you want people to essentially give you their email ID, you can even create a quiz or a game. You can do a lot of these sorts of different things by using tools like Typeform or even Google Forms, and you can do this for free. Your other case scenario is you can ask people to subscribe to your newsletter. Whilst this is great, it may not be the ideal way to start because a lot of people may not subscribe initially itself. But if you have no other way to get people to give you your email address, then you can always rely on the newsletter. So that's what you should focus on in the pre-roll part of your podcast and nothing else. So don't confuse your listener by asking them for too much. Then in the mid-roll of your podcast, so somewhere in the middle of your podcast where it makes sense, let's say between two segments, what you need to do is you need to reiterate your primary call to action. So you can just pause and you say, so for all of you that have forgotten, would absolutely love for you to sign up to my newsletter, or for you to take part in this quiz that we're conducting by heading over to our website and jotting down your details there. That way you can essentially get these email IDs, and these are going to come into a lot of use going forward, especially in building retention and in building sort of loyalty among your fan base. You need to also in the mid-roll add your secondary call to action, and that secondary call to action can be asking your listener to rate your podcast and review your podcast. If you're very brazen, you can even add your tertiary right here itself. So you can say, we would absolutely love if you reviewed our podcast on XYZ platform or rated it on XYZ platform. And if you like what you're hearing, you feel free to follow me on this specific platform. I'm always available to answer any question that you guys may have. I'm very active with my DMs, answer mostly all of them. So if you guys write to me, in the 2 hours post me launching an episode, I'm usually very reactive at those points. So even give them a window of opportunity to actually write into you. And then in your post roll, by this point you should be cognizant of the fact that most people have already left listening to your episode. So you need to reiterate all of these 3 points again. So you can just touch upon your primary call to action so that you don't become irritating, and then you just follow it up by nailing the secondary call to action and your tertiary call to action once again. So follow it up by thanking them for listening and tell them that it would really mean the world to you if you had them rate your podcast across the specific channel that you've chosen. And if they wish to ask you any questions, then they can always reach you at this specific handle, and you are active from this time to this time. So that's the best way to handle calls to action, and make sure that you do this from the start of your show, because it's something that most podcasters tend to forget to do, or they feel too awkward to do, and then they kick themselves in the future because they didn't do it. So I hope that helped, and look forward to seeing you in the next one.